The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd insisting yesterday that Russia is failing in its Ukraine incursion, with Lloyd saying the US wants to see Russia's military capabilities weakened. They spoke at a press conference at an undisclosed location in Poland, near to the border with Ukraine, following a trip to Kyiv where they met Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, pledging American support in the war and announcing that US diplomats would be returning to Ukraine. Let's get some more on all of that with Dr. Peter Caddick-Adams, military historian and defense expert who served as NATO's official historian in Bosnia. Peter, thanks very much for your time. Quite a high-level meeting then, I think it's fair to say, with the US Defense Secretary and the US Secretary of State meeting Zelensky in Ukraine. The hope then, it seems as well from Lloyd the Defense Secretary, that Russian losses will hopefully deter its leadership from repeating its actions elsewhere. America then, it seems, has an eye on what they fear might happen next.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is partly President Zelensky's badgering, there's no other way to put it, in the nicest possible terms, the United States to take the lead on sending all the weapons they can to Ukraine. And his argument is that if you don't do it, if you don't try and hold Russia in Ukraine, and Russia wins, then you will have to fight that battle elsewhere in Europe. And that's a very, very persuasive argument. And he's used the phrase, the arsenal of democracy, which is the phrase that was used in the Second World War about America's industrial might. And that's what the Ukrainians want, and President Zelensky has asked for. Turn on the tap, and then we will do the fighting and the dying, but give us the weapons to do it. And, that's why these two American cabinet members, not just one, but two, I mean, that's how high profile this is.
A critic might look at this and say it's all very well America is offering thoughts and prayers and, yes, some weapons, but plainly not as many as President Zelensky would like. Do you think America will respond in the way that he obviously wants them to?
Well, America has already done that, both in terms of releasing huge amounts of money, but also in terms of sending weapons across the Atlantic. And it's not just any old weapons. There's a very different fight going on in the east against the big Russian push in the Donbass. And what the Ukrainians are short of, amongst other things, is mobile artillery. And that's exactly what America has stepped up to the fence to sort of to send over. And of course, if America takes the lead, then the other NATO countries, and this is very much sort of aimed at NATO and America's leadership of NATO, so it's not just America.
Sure.
But Zelensky hopes that if America takes the lead, then the other countries will follow. And so other countries are starting to chip in with the right kind of weaponry, like mobile artillery. So,
yes,
taking the lead on sending vehicles, and particularly these anti-tank weapons, which have done so well.
America has already, just in the last few days, confirmed that it has sent for the first time anti-artillery radars and artillery, I think they're called howitzer cannons as well. So that is new. So America is certainly doing more than it did. And as we go forward, then, the point that's still being made by Ukraine, still being made by Zelensky, as we said at the start of the conversation, is give us the weapons, we will do the fighting. What state do you think Ukrainian forces are in to make the best use of any equipment that comes their way?
I mean, they do. Well, don't forget, what happened is that ever since the invasion of the Donbass and the taking of the Crimea in 2014, three countries, which is the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, have been training or retraining Ukrainian forces to fight in a very modern way. Because the Russian forces and the Ukrainians come from the same parents. They were trained and indoctrinated militarily in the same way, with the same equipment. And what's happened quite clearly since the 24th of February is that we now know that the Russians stood still doctrinally, and the Ukrainians have moved on with Western help since 2014, and that has paid dividends, and they've absorbed all the lessons. So they've done very, very well in the last 8 years, and they've more than proved the fact that they're able to learn very quickly, they're highly motivated, and step up to all the training and the weaponry that they're given. So they're making incredibly good use of the sort of equipment that is being sent to them. But there's another aspect to this, which is it's messaging. When the United States say something, this is not just directed at a morale booster for the Ukrainian people, it's also a message to Russia. We can out-manufacture you in terms of weaponry, so you ought to stop now. That's the point. We will carry on for as long as it takes, and that's really what Zelensky wants to hear.
Another important message, presumably along the same sort of lines, plans to reopen the US embassy in Kyiv. Diplomatic staff will be returning to Lviv, it seems, from next week, but the long-term plan is to open the embassy again in the capital. Now, when you think back to the start of this conflict, the narrative has it that Russia imagined that taking Kyiv would be a matter of a few days' work, and surely the fact that the US embassy is to reopen there is quite a signal too.
Yeah, it's a hell of a signal, isn't it? And it's not just the US embassy. Nearly all the Western embassies fled. Most didn't go abroad. They went to Lviv, which is the big city over in the west, which I know very well. And that's become, if you like, de facto, the sort of for a while, it looked as though it was going to be the capital of whatever was left of Ukraine. That's a very, very strong message. And the other country that is being messaged very, very strongly by these statements, although it isn't mentioned by name, is Germany, who seem to have fallen behind in terms of political will to send weaponry and are still very, very nervous about standing up to Russia, mostly for energy reasons. And so a lot of this conversation is directed subliminally to Germany as well. And I think these two cabinet ministers are trying to square up for another presidential visit to Europe. And I think that's probably what's on the cards further down the line. And if you remember, the president came over not so long ago, and given that on the 24th of February he wasn't even scheduled to come to Europe at all, that shows you how quickly the crisis blew up and how quickly the United States has sort of responded.
Just briefly on Germany, I think the German response in the last few days has been partly, we'd like to do more, we'd like to send more weapons, but we run the risk of leaving ourselves undefended if we do so.
Yeah, absolutely. The message, but the trouble is, the message is coming out of Germany is very mixed. And what you really want in a moment like this is for the Chancellor of Germany to say, we will overcome these sort of problems. And instead, at each occasion, a lot of Germans, public opinion is massively in favour of sending equipment and weapons and money and so on to Ukraine. And the money's been released, but the heavy weapons aren't being. And the suspicion is this is the personal view of the Chancellor and the President, who both had a long history of being anti-American and anti-NATO. And their speeches seem to be invoking lots of excuses as to why they can't do this, rather than demonstrating that they're more than willing to overcome all the obstacles. So there's so much to play for, and of course this carries on for so this is on and on, going on so quickly. The bread queue humour, which we used to know from Soviet days, because every Russian citizen used to have to queue, has returned, and so all the Russians are saying to each other now, we're in the third month of the 3-day invasion of Ukraine.
Yes. And just briefly, a word on what Russia has said, or at least Russia's ambassador in Washington, saying that Moscow has sent a diplomatic note demanding an end to the American supply of weapons to Ukraine. It's what you'd expect to be said, but it's pretty meaningless, I guess.
It is extraordinary. The Russians are remarkably consistent in terms of complete and total Alice in Wonderland denial of what's happening in reality. And so they have to go through this sort of charade, and one wonders how much some of these diplomats are deeply committed to the words that they're being forced to utter. But that is, that's the world of diplomacy. And if they don't say that, they get recalled, and it'll be an interview without coffee somewhere in the Kremlin. So they will go through this. The trouble is, as and when this whole ghastly business finishes, how on earth Russia picks up the diplomatic pieces is just beyond me, because they have just their words in the media are just sort of rabid racism on steroids, and one really struggles to picture the end state.
Well, does Putin survive when this ends, however this ends? And let's assume it doesn't end in the way that Russia wanted it to or thought it might just a few weeks ago. Does he suffer internal pressure on his leadership, or is he still so extraordinarily well in control of the message internally that he can say whatever he wants and it will be believed?
That's a very good question. And we have to remember that Russia has more people in uniform carrying weapons devoted to internal security than it does in the armed forces doing battle outside Russia. And that's a reflection on Putin's Russia. It's always been the case. But these guys are, mean business. So the country is completely and totally buttoned up. Think Gestapo, think Nazi Germany in 1944 to 45, and you've got Russia today. However, it doesn't mean they've won people's hearts and minds. And we know there are all those internal pressures and all the rest of it. And being cut off from the Western world and media, social media, really, really grating, never mind all the financial sacrifices that the average Russian is having to go through. So I think there will be pressure. We can't go through this sort of saying regime change is something that we desire and we want to bring about. But I think the ordinary Russian may well sooner or later draw their own red line and say, where is this heading? It's heading in somewhere very, very unpleasant. We need to do something about this. But who and when and how? I can't disbelieve the fact that all over Russia there are whispered conversations in darkened corridors by people of power and influence, wondering what to do and when.
Peter, thank you very much. Dr. Peter Caddick-Adams, military historian and defence expert, who served as NATO's official historian in Bosnia.